So then if my dad spoke to me in Cantonese, I would have to reply in Cantonese. And if I didn't do that, I would have to put $1 in the jar. And so maybe that's how they subconsciously... Yeah, wow. That's how I got trained. Welcome to Tell Me Over Tea. My name is Lois.
I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Sylvie.
So, girls, tell me, what are we drinking?
I'm having another hot water. Gotta love that classic hot water.
I am having a ginseng oolong. It is hot this time.
Ooh, I always like a oolong, and ginseng is very good. Whole bowl, great for your body. I am having a lime and lemon drip tea. So it's another one from Drip Tea Hong Kong, and I'm having it hot this time. It's quite sour, but I actually kind of enjoy it, and I can imagine it being really refreshing if it was cold.
Nice. So
today we're talking about languages, and I am really looking forward to hearing more about what we think, because I think we all have very interesting relationships with the languages that we speak. And so I'll start by saying that I speak English predominantly as my first language. You can say that Cantonese is my mother tongue, but I also speak Mandarin, and these are the three main ones that I do at the moment. What about you, Steph?
I predominantly speak English as well. I speak Cantonese, though mostly conversational. I'm not very good at Cantonese that's very specific about a topic, or Cantonese that's like really scholarly. And then I can kind of understand like the most basic Mandarin. And then I can say that I don't understand in Mandarin. And that's about it. Where's the bathroom? Maybe. Also that.
Helpful. Always helpful.
Yeah. Sylvie?
I speak English. It has definitely evolved since I was a kid. I can't actually remember first language being English or Cantonese. I feel like they were pretty much at the same time, like when I was a child. But because I went to a local Chinese school as a child, my Cantonese back then was much better than it is now. So the Cantonese that I speak now is only to a certain level, since when I left local school and I entered into international school, yes, I still spoke Cantonese on a daily basis. I speak to my mom, I speak to my, friends, but I didn't keep it up. So kind of similar to you, Steph, it is very scholarly and very technical vocab. I will struggle a little bit to fully understand and also to speak. I also learned French in school.
As did I.
Okay. I can't say that I can speak it in the sense that like I can even on a casual basis, I can't. But I can understand if people are speaking quite slowly. I can understand definitely certain very basic things that they say. I can still kind of speak a little bit, because I did do it for A level. I also learned Spanish a little bit, but again, I can't say that I can speak them in a proficient way. Wow. Just, like bonjour, ça va, like very basic. Mandarin, also on the same par as French. Actually, probably even much less. But much less, because I did learn it when I was in primary school. And then when I went to international school, I was like, nah, I want to learn French. I don't want to learn Mandarin. And I just didn't keep it up. And actually, I find Mandarin like extremely... I mean, people say that, like a lot of local Hong Kong people speak English, Mandarin, and Cantonese. And, they can speak Mandarin, they can understand Mandarin very easily. And I'm sitting here like, how? Because it sounds so different. I recently was in Shanghai and I was like a complete foreigner. Like I said ni hao, and then the taxi driver I was speaking to said something to me, and I was like, yep, over my head, no idea what is going on. For me, it sounds very different, and obviously
I think it sounds very different.
There's Cantonese in Hong Kong is all the characters are traditional Chinese, so I struggle to read simplified Chinese. You know, I go there, I'm like, what is this? Not that I can read everything. My reading is also not the best, but I don't get this whole, how does everybody in Hong Kong speak Mandarin? It's insane.
I feel like when they say that it's easy, what they mean is that it's easier than picking up another completely unrelated language. Like, I think if you live in China, like for prolonged periods of time, or if you go to China often, I think you can pick it up a lot faster just by ear. Yeah. But otherwise, yeah, it is a completely different language, and it is very hard to like guess what people are saying or to like figure out what people are saying.
I think grammatically as well. I feel like Cantonese, it's such, you know, like spoken Cantonese is different from like written Chinese, that like Cantonese is so colloquial, it's so much slang that, you know, Mandarin, you know, how you grammatically say certain things also is sort of backwards to Cantonese, or just is just so different that I'm like, you know, sometimes I don't know, and if I'm in a situation I have to speak Mandarin, I don't know, I would kind of like just say it in like Cantonese, but in like a slightly weird tone to try to make it sound like Mandarin.
Yeah, I've been there.
I can't think of an example, but yeah, like if I don't know the word in Mandarin, I'll just kind of like make it a bit more Mandarin sounding.
I mean, there's a lot more sounds in Cantonese than Mandarin, so that's also part of the reason why I think a lot of foreigners, like people maybe from the West especially, find it much easier to pick up Mandarin than it is to pick up Cantonese, because Cantonese has 9 tones versus 4 tones in Mandarin, and so it makes it easier to learn as a language if you're talking about speaking, if you're doing Mandarin as a foreigner. But I agree, Sylvie, I think Cantonese and Mandarin sounds completely different. And there's not one way of deciphering one to the other just by knowing one of the languages. But
yeah, I just think it's really interesting when people say that there are less tones, because as someone who grew up like in a Cantonese speaking household, the tones don't, like, I don't register however many tones there are. I just know if I said it correctly or if I didn't say it correctly.
Yeah.
Because like everything that I know about Cantonese is based off of just my own ear and like knowing whether or not it feels right, which is like how I predominantly learned most of my Cantonese words. Like it's just by hearing television or by hearing like other people say certain words.
Yeah.
And so when people say like, oh yeah, Mandarin has less tones, it's like, yes, I agree. But because I never listened to those tones growing up, it feels the same difficulty to me, you know? Like it feels like still that I don't know the tones, and that like maybe it sounds wrong in my brain, but I can't suss it out as well as I can when I'm speaking Cantonese and I say a word and I'm like, oops, like that definitely was not correct. And then I have to like sort of feel it out to feel out like which tone is actually the correct tone.
Yeah. I mean, Sylvie's the only person here that's actually learned Cantonese in a school setting, right?
That's not true. We go to class together.
Oh, yes, sorry. Yes, you go to... Actually, I am the only person in this conversation now that didn't learn Cantonese in a school setting whatsoever.
What do you mean?
Interesting. But you're the best one at it.
No, I mean, I learned Cantonese based off of hearing it, because I learned Mandarin only at school.
Oh, so you never had... like
a Cantonese education.
So when I was in local school, we had Mandarin lessons and we had, you know, Chinese lessons, but it was Cantonese. You know, it was like reading, writing, whatever, like not literature, but back in the day, you know, you'd read passages and you'd write and do exercises and this and that. So in your school, you never had that. You just had Mandarin.
So I did 1 year at a local school, and so that was the only year, primary 1, that I had Cantonese education. And then in my second year, I went to an international school. So I technically have only had 1 year of Cantonese school education, and then I went straight to Mandarin. And so I think that explains why I have always found Mandarin much more innate, in a sense, to learn and understand, because I learned through pinyin, which was to do the tones through the alphabets in Mandarin. And so Mandarin feels supernatural to me, especially at this stage. So I will say that I lost Mandarin almost, like I had like 20% left maybe at some point, because I went to school in the UK, and the only chance I had of like being in touch with it or being able to, I didn't use it at all. The only chance I had to be in touch with it was through music and through watching television. And so not being able to practice a language or to speak it kind of does deteriorate your ability to use it. But then the minute I moved back to Hong Kong 4 years ago, I started using it a lot again because of work. And then also moving back kind of changed or transitioned the way I consume the media in this region of the world. And then so I basically, I will say that even though I didn't have Mandarin for such a big portion of my life, I am probably beyond, I'm probably like professional beyond like normal proficient at this stage, which is really cool. Like I didn't quite imagine myself being in this position again, but I actually didn't learn Cantonese whatsoever in a school. And so it just comes from speaking with my parents, watching TV like we all did, and then listening to music. And that was pretty much how I've made my way around Hong Kong at this point.
Do you think you're more proficient in Mandarin than in Cantonese?
That's a really good question. Do you know what? If I'm actually in a strictly professional setting, like in work at the moment, I do use all three languages. And I will say that I'm probably more confident in Mandarin than I am in Cantonese if I were to speak very professionally. If I were to be in a 10-minute presentation today and it had to be in Mandarin or Cantonese, I probably would pick Mandarin.
That's insane.
It's insane, right?
Yeah.
That's crazy. Yeah,
because actually, I think professional Cantonese or Cantonese that's not colloquial feels a bit more foreign to me because I didn't learn it maybe like the way that you would do traditionally, and so I'm missing a bit of foundation. But you two are getting lots of foundation at this point, because
I mean, we are still at sort of primary 3-4 level, but sure.
Yeah, let's
I mean,
say that.
what is it like? What is it like to learn it at this stage of your life, and maybe after having had so many touch points with it, but not to do it properly until now?
It makes me regret not learning it sooner. I did Saturday Cantonese class when I was a kid, but then like very quickly my parents were like, we don't want to force you to do this, and you seem like you hate this. So I think I stopped really early on. And it was a lot of just like memorization. And so you would read a passage, you would memorize it, and then the next class you would like say it back, and then you would like memorize another passage. That was like the only way that we learned, and I absolutely hated it. And it didn't really like apply to my life at the time because like I was not speaking Cantonese except to my family, and even then barely, because a lot of my aunts and uncles and my mom like speak English, so it wasn't really being utilized, and I was definitely not appreciating like knowing another language. So now that I'm older, I'm like, I wish I had done it sooner and stuck with it. But also I knew at the time that like as like a kid, if it's not relevant to your life, it's really hard to convince a child to like do a thing that is like, oh, like 10 years, 15 years down the line will like benefit you.
For sure.
I'm sort of quite similar to you as well, Steph, in the sense that, yeah, when you were a kid, if it doesn't apply to you, you kind of don't really see the need in learning it. But I kind of fell off track with it in a sense, because I guess the nature of the environment I was in a local school, so I was very predominantly Cantonese. But because, not that I had an extremely horrendous experience in local school, but I was always kind of made aware that, oh, you know, you're mixed, and, you know, I don't look like a local. And I was kind of in the back of my mind, I was always aware of this. So then when I went to international school, it just sort of, I don't know if it was like consciously this decision to, I think it's an unconscious decision, just more naturally I kind of gravitated towards learning. Well, obviously my English was not very good, so which is why I had to improve my English back then, because my Cantonese was better.
This is so interesting.
And then I was always I was fascinated by the whole kind of change in the system, and everybody in my environment was speaking more English, so I spoke more English. And then when I went to like secondary school, then there was like this whole other thing, like, oh, there's French. And I actually actively remember, like, I didn't want to learn Mandarin. It wasn't like I disliked Cantonese or Mandarin, but I like languages in a sense. I just wanted to learn other things. And it wasn't until I think now that I'm older, and again, it's sort of finding this appreciation of the language, because for me, it's more of preserving the language, and it is part of my culture still, because yeah, I want to be able to, I don't know, it's just now, I feel like it's a bit more important to me than before, because I remember when after international school and I studied in the UK, just like Lois said, you know, it just kind of slips away a bit if you're not speaking to people, if you're not actively having conversations and you're in that environment. And I think, you know, and I think every time I kind of came back to Hong Kong, it was solidifying this more idea that I'm more of a Guai Mui now, you know what I mean? And it was, I mean, I'm still a Guai Mui. Guai Mui, FYI, is a slang word for people that don't look local, or basically it translates to a white person, which I am half. So yeah, I think now it's evolved through time from when I was a youngster to now.
Yeah, on the topic of like preservation, I always think that's really interesting because as a kid, or like maybe like in, you know, coming into high school or whatever, I very strictly remember being like, oh, if I ever have children, we won't speak in my mother tongue, which like maybe not my mother tongue, but like so my grandparents come from this place in China called Toisan. So it's like in like the Guangdong area, and there's a dialect there that they speak called Toisan Ma. And I remember very distinctly being like, oh, I will never really know how to speak that. Like there's no way to pass that down. And there's not really a way to preserve that part of the culture, even though it's like the only language that my grandparents speak. And even now when I'm learning Cantonese, I find that it's really sad that I have this proximity language, but it's not the native language of my ancestors. You know what I mean? And it's something that at this point I feel like I could learn, but because it is sort of a dying language, and because I don't really go back there, you know, so there's like no point in using it. Whereas now I live in Hong Kong, so I know Cantonese. The urgency, despite me like feeling the dread, like the urgency is also not there to learn that language, aside from preservation, you know?
I mean, Cantonese for the three of us now probably feels like the language that will eventually become that dialect that we want to pass down, right? Because I mean, it is a dialect in itself. But then, like you said, Steph, like I have, if you would say a mother tongue that is not Cantonese, because my grandparents come from Hainan, so Hainanese is a completely different dialect. And the only reason why I understand a very minute, not 0.012 kind of percentile of Hainanese is because I spent a few years living with my grandmother when I was back here in the beginning of the pandemic, and so I started to having to learn to converse a little bit. She speaks Cantonese fully, but there are moments when her dementia kicks in and like she like full on speaks Hainanese, and I was like, oh, I kind of want to know how to converse with her as well. But then also I did actually used to, when I was younger, go back to Hainan like every 3-4 years with my parents and my cousins. And so maybe I'm a little bit more like exposed to that part of my culture or the roots of the language itself. But for sure, Cantonese is now the thing that I feel I would want to pass down to my children and make sure that they do speak, because it is also a bit of a dying dialect at this point. It's a controversial thing, because I went to Guangzhou recently and there's a very big portion of our generation that does not speak any Guangdonghua, which is Cantonese, because the major language now is Mandarin, and I see how being able to operate in the majority language in mainland China is incredibly important. I mean, also in mainland China they call it Putonghua instead of Mandarin. But like identity is so much wrapped in the language that we speak, and so maybe at this age as well, especially for me, I do feel that my grasp or the way I see languages and my desire to continue speaking it and mastering it feels much more important, because I have a more sure sense of my identity, I guess, culturally. So obviously on the topic of like cultural identity, there's also like personality, and I don't know about the two of you, but the thing that I struggle with, I think the most in Mandarin and Cantonese versus English, is that I have a difficult time conveying my personality. And so when I run into a scenario where I want to be 100% or completely myself or really comfortable, my default will always be English, because I think so much of my upbringing and my formative years revolved around me using English to develop and express myself. And so I struggle with Cantonese and Mandarin because sometimes I feel like maybe I'm putting my sentences together. These days, not so much. So there's less thinking behind the structure of my language and my delivery. But still, I am struggling to grasp what it means to morph my personality into these two languages, basically.
I feel like I mean, I don't know. This is only if I feel like I'm a different version of me when I'm speaking, or like my personality, and like when I conversate in English and when I conversate in Cantonese, because my Cantonese is to a certain extent, as I said before, you know, I haven't kept it up and I've picked it back up recently. I feel like when I communicate people in Cantonese, if you're just talking fully Cantonese, I definitely have this sort of like loading moment in my head. Like I'm finding words, I'm still, you know, threading the sentence together. So for sure, I feel like now as an adult, I really don't know. I feel like it has to come from maybe someone that knows me, that can understand, as in that can understand English and Cantonese as well. Like if my personality shines through the same as both Cantonese and in English, I feel like I can express myself better in English just because purely I am more proficient in English, if that makes sense. Because in Cantonese, there are definitely cultural aspects to Cantonese that I like, very colloquial slang that I also don't understand, because I grew up, you know, speaking Cantonese to my mom, and she doesn't entertain the sort of very crass kind of language that is used, you know, on a daily basis. You know, my mom doesn't swear in Cantonese. The swearing kind of comes from, you know, what I learned in school and maybe friends, but I don't actively use it. So how I speak Cantonese and how I deliver Cantonese, like phrases, and when I conversate with people, is how I would speak. Not that I would speak like my mom, but, you know, I don't really know how to use the very crude way of expressing myself, or the crude way of communicating, I should say, which is a whole, like, that is Cantonese. There's like a whole like this little bubble of, so in a way I feel I lack in that sense as well, just because my mom doesn't like swearing in general, and she'd always tell us off if we say certain things. Not even extremely bad swear words, just
entry level swearing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Entry level. That's an interesting way to put it.
I mean, even now, I fall into Chinglish mainly, because I do have that sense of, I don't know, it's like this comfort, you know, when I'm hanging around people, you know, my friends, that I can communicate in both English and Cantonese. And sometimes there are moments where you can't fully express something that you want to say in English or in Cantonese, and you just throw in that, you know, Cantonese word or English word, or, you know, how I speak to my brother. You know, we just took a trip to Tokyo and we were just Chinglishing the whole way.
I love that.
And a lot of the times we have this, the Cantonese sort of like our secret language. When we're abroad, you know, we can speak in Cantonese. I'll just give an example of when I was traveling with my brother and I. And obviously, like, we were in Japan, nobody understands Cantonese. So we'd be like, oh, people might understand English. So we just spoke to each other in Cantonese. Yeah, I don't really know, to be honest. Like my person, I feel like because just based off of the fact that I'm more comfortable and more proficient in English, I feel maybe I express myself better in English than Cantonese.
Yeah, I think personality wise, I feel a lot of the times when I'm speaking Cantonese, I sound a lot like a child.
Yeah.
Because that's where the majority of my vocabulary came from. Like I learned Cantonese up until, maybe 5th grade or something. So all of the context that I had to this language prior to moving to Hong Kong was stuff that I used to say as a kid. I distinctly remember using vocabulary that is very childish and getting like weird looks because I don't know what that word is, or like maybe people would use like a different word like backpack. I think usually you would just say
Bulong.
doi, like for a bag. Yeah, but I used to say shu bao, and I still do that sometimes, but that's a very like school, it literally is like a
school
like
bag.
a book bag.
Yes, a school bag.
Yeah, but in my brain, a shoe bao is a backpack. But it isn't, I guess, if you're an adult. So it's stuff like that like maybe gets me in trouble sometimes. Or maybe not in trouble, but just it is a disconnect from my actual personality, because I think in English, I'm a lot less childlike because I have the vocabulary. But also I think like means of nonverbal communication is something that I got really good at while I was working, because there was a short period of time where I did a lot of movies, and being on a movie setting, you have to like be really, really quick with communication. And I was working with this wonderful artist. Her name is Yumi, and she and I basically figured out a way to very quickly communicate, where I would give her a face of confusion, or a face of like, basically like anytime I did a certain type of face, she would be like, I need to repeat this, or okay, like you need to process this for a couple seconds. And it also added to the sort of childlike personality that I had, because I think kids also, when they're grappling with language, a lot of times the way that they express themselves is through body or through like facial expressions. But also it worked as a shorthand. It was really good to be like, hey, if I don't understand something, or if I'm processing something, I'm just gonna like open my eyes real wide and blink a couple times, and then you'll repeat it, and then I'll be like, oh, okay, I got it, it loaded. Figure it out. That happened enough that it was our own separate language, Cantonese adjacent, just to like help with all of that. But yeah, so Chinglish I think is really interesting to me, because when I was younger and I didn't really have a good grasp on Cantonese, English was used to fill the Cantonese words that I didn't know. But now, because I have lived in Hong Kong for 10 years and my Cantonese is pretty good, sometimes I lose grasp of English words, and then I'm saying the Cantonese words as if I can't, like, because I just can't remember it, and I feel really dumb sometimes because I'm like, I don't know either of these languages. Like, I'm losing the one that I used to rely on, and the one that I'm learning, I don't know all the vocab for. So I'm just like stuck in between, being like, okay,
that's cool. Like you flipped it around. I think I know what you mean by that, because there are some words in Cantonese that there isn't an English word for. There is no direct translation.
No. Okay. It would be cool if that was the case. If it was like, yeah, there's not a word for this. It's not that. I forget the most simple words. Like, if I can't remember bowl, I'm gonna be like, oh yeah, like give me the one. But the thing is, you can't use it all the time. Like, if the person that you're speaking to doesn't know both languages, then you kind of just sat there looking like this person doesn't know English. But it's like, no. I learned that first, I swear. So
okay, I see where you're coming from. I do think that we live in a city where there's the luxury of most people being somewhat bilingual to an extent, as in enough to understand basic English if you're a Cantonese native speaker, because we, after all, were colonized by the Brits, and so there's definitely still a lot of English that's rooted in this city. And I don't know if the two of you would agree with me, but in a work setting, or most Cantonese native speakers that I interact with are incapable of just speaking Cantonese. There will always be English in the middle of their sentence, and definitely and most often used incorrectly in terms of grammar, but there's always English. Like, there are certain things I can name off the top of my head. In a work setting, people will go, oh, this is the deadline, and they will say in Cantonese, oh, or you gone deadline, and that means we have to rush for a deadline. but we don't like to say the word deadline in Cantonese. It always just is in English. And so I think the work culture here is that there's a lot of documents or official papers that are still in English for certain reasons. And so there's still this bilingual headspace that people work in like the work culture. And so that's allowed me to slip in a bit easier than if we were just to operate in Cantonese, like moving back here as a person who's working.
Yeah, I actually used to get tricked by that.
Yeah.
I used to think that people knew more English than they did. Because I'd be
it's only certain words.
Yeah, it's only certain words, but it's actually quite a few words.
Yep.
Like, and you can sort of fake your way into
knowing English.
Well, I guess tricking me into thinking that you know English.
Yes.
I think it was a little bit jarring when I realized that like a lot of people actually, those are just the words that they use in place of the Cantonese characters. Like it just is the norm because there is so much slang in Cantonese and it's so hard to keep up with. Being a second language, it's so hard to keep up with. I feel like even locals sometimes, it's like, oh, there's this new slang. We're going to use this now. And I'm just like, I give up. I can't. I don't
For
know.
sure. Industry slang. So there's industry
It's too
slang and then
much.
there's like the social slangs. So these two things become, I mean, to be honest though, I'm curious to know if you two feel that you are bilingual or do you feel that you are majority one language but then you speak the other to a certain extent?
What do you mean? What's the definition of being bilingual? Is it both languages you speak have to be proficient and at the same level, or
I actually don't know the definition of
what constitutes as being bilingual?
Can you think and like
I mean, I think I would consider myself as bilingual.
yeah.
I mean, I don't know what the definition is. Maybe you can ask yourself, do you think, what you were probably about to say, do you think in Cantonese? Do you dream in Cantonese? Do you have certain thoughts in Cantonese or in English?
I mean, Google tells me
I don't know.
with a 5-second search that bilingual just means speaking two languages fluently. So I guess...
I mean, if I'm being extremely harsh on myself, probably not. But if I'm giving myself a bit of credit, then yeah, I'm bilingual.
I would say I'm pretty bilingual. I'm like on the just acceptable side of bilingual, I would probably say.
I actually think that both of you are I would say that you are both bilingual. Maybe my headspace when asking this was to do with like how the language holds space in our day-to-day like thinking patterns even beyond just speaking, maybe because I actually think I think in both languages. I don't really know how my brain indicates which one is which, but then when I was young, actually, my parents, so like Sylvie, I had the flip side of what she experienced, which is when she didn't speak a lot of English when she was super young, and then she was predominantly in a Cantonese speaking school. But then for me, I was speaking a lot more Cantonese when I was younger because of my household, and then when I moved to an international school, I had to speak a lot in English, and my English was not great back then. And so my parents started doing this thing where they would speak to us in both languages, and we would have a jar for when we had to put $1 in of our lengyongtin, so like the money that you get, like kind of like petty cash you get from your parents when you were really young to buy candy. Allowance, yes, not petty cash, sorry. But then so then if my dad spoke to me in Cantonese, I would have to reply in Cantonese. And if I didn't do that, I would have to put $1 in the jar. And so maybe that's how they subconsciously... Yeah,
Wow.
That's how I got trained to think like to switch as quickly as I could when I was super young. English was the thing that I struggled with. So then it was more them speaking to me in English and then me having to switch and reply in English. That was the thing that I struggled with when I was super young.
Thinking back now, just from what you just said, I remember when I was younger, I think it's navigating, for me at home, it's navigating two languages because my dad spoke English and my mum spoke Cantonese, and my mum speaks my dad in English, sorry. And I think I like vaguely remember when I was a child, it was hard for me to navigate when my dad was speaking to me, as in because I went to school and it was predominantly, I had English class, but it was like, I don't know, once a day, and everything else was in Cantonese. So when I go home, it always is sort of a little bit, not a delay, but whenever I remember my dad would be reading a book to me, like an English book, and I would take ages to understand, like, a page of it, because it just, I struggled to understand. Yeah, it's very, very weird. That was just a thought that came into my mind. But also, I think I had a thought when you said about if we're bilingual or not. I feel for me, it's also an ego thing, in a sense, like, as in not an ego thing, as in like in my mind, I want to perceive myself as being bilingual because I am half Chinese and I am half English. I guess for me, like, that is important, which goes back to why I am taking Cantonese classes now, because I want to be bilingual. You know what I mean? Even though maybe my level isn't, like, I don't know, fluent. My Cantonese is definitely not as fluent as it is my English. But if somebody asks me if I'm bilingual, I'll say yes.
You should say yes. You should say yes.
Yeah. I think on the topic of thinking in a language, I realized maybe a couple years back that I was like, oh, I'm actually thinking in Cantonese now. Like, it took a while, and it took a lot of like living in Hong Kong, but it doesn't happen all of the time, but it happens more often than it used to. And that was basically the switch for me. And also, I always say this as sort of like a joke, where like I can trick people into like thinking that I'm fluent in Cantonese if they only talk to me for like a little bit. but I think that time has gotten like longer and longer. I can have a full conversation, and I think for me that's pretty good. That's probably a good indication that I am bilingual. Whereas like when I first moved here, I think if you answer one word or like a couple of words, then people can't tell. And I'm sure people still can. I'm sure if I have like full-fledged conversations with people, I've gotten a lot that the grammar that I use is all over the place, and it's like more like an English speaker than it is like a native Cantonese speaker. But also I've gotten a lot of like, oh yeah, I'll ask friends sometimes, oh, did I say this correctly? And they'll be like, you didn't, but most people don't say it correctly, so actually you're fine. And I'm like, oh, okay. Cantonese is such an interesting language in that way, where a lot of times even native people aren't saying it in the true correct like pronunciation, and so there's a lot of leeway.
Yes, there's a lot of lanyam, which is like lazy Cantonese speaking if you translate it directly. And for sure, you and Sylvie are definitely learning the proper way to say it. But then if you hear on the streets, most people are just running through the sounds more often than not.
Yeah, but even in our Chinese lessons, I think I don't know, the other day I think I asked our teacher, this isn't how it's properly pronounced, right? And she goes, no, but nobody pronounce it like that. Everybody, like in normal day-to-day life, people won't say, for example, you, we say lei, but actually it's nei,
Yeah.
So she's like, yeah, well, nobody does it, so it's fine, like everybody in Hong Kong has just got the lazy tone. But
I also feel a lot of being bilingual is like, if somebody can understand you, maybe that's the threshold, even if the accent is incorrect or whatever. Also, there's this pet peeve that I have where like people correcting you, sometimes it's educational and it makes sense, but sometimes I'm like, if you can correct me, you also know what I was trying to say. So
yes, I was about to ask you if the comments that people have made about your Cantonese was unsolicited, because I have my thoughts on that.
Actually, I think that most people are like, oh, you're from America? You speak Cantonese? It's pretty good for an American person.
You've set the bar way low.
No.
Oh, 1000%. It's on the floor.
Mate, shout out to Helen, our Cantonese teacher. She's always saying, 幾好啊, do okay 㗎啦. It's pretty good already, guys. You should be happy with yourself. I'm sitting there like,
yeah, I'm like, fuck, dude.
The bar is on the floor.
No.
The bar is fully on the floor.
But yeah, I think it's a little bit detrimental to the dying language of Cantonese itself if we're so like hard on policing people about it. Like, even native speakers don't follow rules of how to speak Cantonese, and so I think we just need to cut everyone some slack, and let's just make sure that we all understand each other and just let that be. Because when I first moved back, I would say I had a lot less Cantonese than today in terms of how well I can communicate. I didn't have problems with understanding, it's just more the style of delivery. But I was very concerned about how foreign I sounded in my Cantonese. Like, it was something that actually affected me at work. I also probably really wanted to fit back into this culture after being away from it for so long. And so there was so much of that push and pull of wanting to not sound like I was a second language Cantonese speaker at work, because, you know, in a workspace you get a lot more respect when you feel that you have better hone of the way you're communicating. And so that came into play. And then, but even like, I mean, I'm curious, Sylvie, when someone like serves you at a coffee place, do they speak to you in English immediately? Like, what is the first language that most people would serve you in? Because I think that is somewhat a reflection of like expectation in terms of your identity.
Yeah, it really ranges. It kind of ties in with, again, when about the whole, you know, do you consider yourself bilingual? And I do, because I actively practice communicating to people in Cantonese. And because I am mixed, and to certain local people, I don't look local, they will not speak to me in Cantonese, even though I am speaking to them in Cantonese. Multiple occasions,
Oof.
you know, I'll go to like a 7-Eleven or there was one time, I remember this was during COVID, and I think that I was doing like one of these staycation things, and I was having afternoon tea. and the server came up to me and asked me what tea I wanted, or I think he was asking me what, I forgot. He was asking me something in English, and I responded to him in Cantonese. And then he proceeded to speak to me. Actually, he said, "Wow, your Cantonese is so good." He said this in English. And then I said, "Yeah, I'm from here. I can speak Cantonese." And he still proceeded to speak to me in English, you know. But I'm, you know, these situations happen to me a lot, you know, and in a way I feel like I'm a little bit not numb by it, but I'm so used to it that on their side, you know, I don't know if they're genuinely just surprised, and like, you know, they maybe just don't come across many mixed people that speak Cantonese, or people that don't look local that speak Cantonese. So I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. And I think also maybe they want to speak to me in English. So then I come into the situation where like, should I speak to them in English or should I press for Cantonese? You know, it's this sort of delicate like line where you're like, you don't really know. But then it's also such a kind of bypassing moment that you know, it's not like you're having some sort of deep conversation with this person. And and there's also but I also have moments where I speak to people in Cantonese and they respond to me in Cantonese, but then they compliment me in Cantonese. Wow, you know, they're still surprised as to like why my Cantonese is so good, because I guess they are purely judging me from my appearance.
Yeah.
And
clearly you've defied some sort of stereotype that they've built in their head about mixed race people.
Yeah, and actually, like, I feel there's a lot of people that are like me, and there are people that are maybe not even mixed that can speak like fluent Cantonese, probably even better than me, you know? It's which again solidifies or like reinforces why because maybe people prejudge me for my appearance, that I am unable to speak Cantonese is another factor why I want to be able to speak it, if that makes sense. Yeah. Steph, have you come into situations where, you know, people don't realize that you can speak Cantonese, or do people speak to you in English, or do they speak to you in Cantonese in the get-go?
I think usually if I can help it, and it's like a situation where like I need information or it's for, yeah, usually if it's something like checking in at the airport the other day, I try and do that in English because for me it's my information that I need for myself. So if you can give that information to me, even if it inconveniences you a little bit because it's not your native tongue, like I would prefer it that way so that it doesn't screw me over. Usually I think for just like regular conversation, I don't really mind if people speak to me in Cantonese first, and I don't really get people speaking to me in English unless I walk in there speaking English. Like if I'm on the phone or if I'm with a friend, because I have an American accent, people mostly are like, oh, okay, this girl probably, if she does know how to speak Cantonese, like that's not her preferred method or whatever. Yeah, but I try usually to make people, if it's not a situation where I need information from somebody or if I need a service from somebody that can only be explained in English, or like if I don't know how to explain it in Cantonese, then I will default to English. Otherwise, if it's just casual, I will try and speak Cantonese as much as I can. Because also like on that point of when people approach you and you don't know if they want to speak English to practice, I think like especially when I first moved here, a lot of the times I was like, okay, I'm going to use my appearance to my advantage because people will assume that I am fluent. And it doesn't always work. Sometimes people are impatient and mean, and they will be like, why is this girl who looks full, you know, like a Hong Kong local, why is she so slow? And it's like, well, I'm not, but I also like, I put myself in the situation because I want to experience, you know, the full linguistic experience.
The Hong Kong experience.
The grilling feeling.
Yeah, like I've been yelled at by taxi drivers. Like I've been called dumb and slow, like, you know, when I'm buying stuff. But not so much anymore. But back in the day, oh my God, it has happened.
Terrible.
Yeah.
It's so weird. It's so weird. It's just so weird how everything is just predetermined or judged by how you look, because they would say that to you because they would assume that you're like a local, and then they would praise me because I look like a white person. Do you know what I mean? It's
the same scenario on two different people, and it's very different.
But I also think that that's not the case. I think that people who are mean are going to be mean regardless. So like even if they have to deal with you in English, they'll probably say shit about you behind your back. You know what I mean? Where it's like if you're speaking Cantonese to them, they can say it to your face. And like most people, super nice, you know, great, patient, whatever. Some people just are mean and impatient, and that sucks. And, you know, I've been on the other side of the coin where people have to deal with people in another language, and then they'll come to me thinking that I'm native and be like, God, that was so horrible, right? And I'd sit there and be like, no, not really. You're just accommodating somebody. Like, yeah, it's inconvenient a little bit, but
for sure, I think that if you're someone who has only lived in an environment where you speak the predominant language, sometimes there's a bit lack of empathy for someone who doesn't have that language in a better grasp than you, or like in the same level of grasp as you. And so maybe the three of us kind of can relate to that, because to some extent in different versions of our reality we've experienced being like the secondary culture or the secondary language to the space that we are in or the place that we live in. And so for sure, if someone is in need of help, I think in English or in Cantonese in a work setting, I find myself being like almost not overly, but I find myself being extremely sensitive to that, or like sometimes even overly catering to that. But it's something I definitely think about, because I do not feel that we should take for granted that everyone speaks the language that the majority of the people speak in any given like space or scenario. And I think it's really like it's really sad when we have to make someone feel so othered because of a language, and it kind of deprives, like just how before I had better grasp of Cantonese, I feel like people who converse with me in Cantonese are deprived of really understanding me as a person because of my delivery and or lack thereof. So I mean, in my head I was just thinking as you two were kind of sharing, I actually get English spoken to me quite a lot here, which is interesting, because I think that I am as local as you can look when it comes to my race, because I am Cantonese through and through. Chinese through and through. And then so I think my giveaway, as I have asked some people, is the way I dress or the way I carry myself, like physical body language and the way we dress. And so in back in the day when I was super young, I actually felt that it still exists in our society, I think in Hong Kong very specifically, because of our post-colonial like nature, but speaking English gives you an air of superiority sometimes, or people feel you are superior when you speak English. And so when I was really young, before obviously I built my sense of identity or understood what cultural nuances were, I felt really proud when someone used to speak to me in English in the get-go. But these days, if someone does that, I am actually a little bit offended. Like, in somewhere in me is a little bit like, I like do a wince without doing it in my face, hopefully, because I'm a little bit put off that they have just assumed that I will go with English, because I now feel that I can do Cantonese perfectly all right. And then so I then do this thing where I like very intentionally speak in good Cantonese just to like shove it back in their face.
That's really interesting. I feel like, can you explain that more actually? Explain more about that reaction and like, about...
Maybe because if someone speaks to me in English, I take it subconsciously as information that they feel I don't belong here. And so they've gone with a language that they're not so comfortable with, but they would rather do that than assume that I can speak Cantonese, right? Because if you think about the logic of it, they're using English, which is probably their second language, if you're a native here. And so they'd rather do that than like take a bet on maybe the fact that I would speak Cantonese. And so somehow that rubs me, I don't think it's malicious whatsoever, don't get me wrong. It just rubs me the wrong way. I get a little bit, either I'm offended or a bit sad, because then I feel maybe that I don't belong as much as I wish for myself to, based on how far I've gone with the language, I guess.
Yeah. I just think it's also interesting when you brought up the point that because it's like Hong Kong is a British colony and like English is seen in a lot of ways as being superior, that like they speak to you in English as a form of respect, or like as a form of like, you know, like hierarchy, right? Like they immediately establish a hierarchy. I don't know if it's...
Maybe that's true.
I mean, like, I don't know what every person is thinking, right? But when you explained it at first and then explained your reaction to it, I was thinking like, oh, but isn't it the opposite technically? I mean, you still are being othered in a way that is like immediate and apparent, but then instead of being othered as a way of being put down or whatever, by that logic, technically, they're putting you on the upper hand of the hierarchy.
Actually, Steph, the way you've just put that for me is kind of in a perspective I've not thought about before. And if we were to just play along with the fact that maybe that was what was in their head, the thing that probably bugs me at this stage when that happens is actually to do with my privilege or my relationship with my privilege. And it's such a big topic, and without going into too much detail, I suspect that the thing that gets me or gives me the ick when someone speaks to me in English is that they have assumed my privilege. And because I moved back and I have begun predominantly working in the nonprofit sector, there's a lot of my privilege that I've worked really hard to kind of mask or to hide, or I just feel I don't want to be at the forefront of how someone perceives me. And so maybe that has kind of bled into my personal life, and then also the way I perceive language and privilege around that. And so when someone speaks to me in English, I feel that they have decided that I am this maybe expat or this English educated kid who doesn't speak Cantonese or isn't down to earth or isn't local. I think there's so many of these attachments that I have in my head, which is probably just in my head. But that's probably what gives me like the internal, maybe sometimes external, because my face is bad at hiding how I feel, like the ick when someone just opens their mouth and speaks in English at like a coffee shop. And I just really wish they would speak to me in Cantonese. I guess that's what it is.
Well, I mean, I'm sure we can delve more into this topic in another episode because it definitely has a lot of substance and we can get into it. But for now, we are out of time. So we will see you in the next episode. Bye!